There are moments in American politics when a man finally meets the limits of the costume he has been wearing, and the country watches the costume fall off in real time. Hakeem Jeffries had one of those moments this month, and I do not believe the Democratic Party is going to recover from it before the next election cycle, and possibly not before the one after that. The press conference was supposed to be a counterpunch. The setting was supposed to be commanding. The minority leader of the House of Representatives, flanked by his caucus, was supposed to deliver a response to the president that reset the terms of the debate and reminded the country that the opposition party still had a pulse. None of that happened. What happened instead was a performance so brittle, so visibly underprepared, so completely outmatched by the man on the other end of the exchange, that I sat there watching it and understood, for the first time in months, why the party that produced it has been losing for as long as it has been losing. I am not going to pretend this surprised me. I am not going to pretend it surprised anyone who has been paying attention to what Hakeem Jeffries actually is, rather than to what his admirers have been telling us he is. The reckoning has been coming. The cameras simply caught up. Let me take you back, because to understand the humiliation you watched, you have to understand the construction that made the humiliation inevitable. January 2023. Hakeem Jeffries is elevated to the leadership of the House Democratic Caucus, the successor to Nancy Pelosi, the first black leader of either party in either chamber, and the press coverage that accompanies the elevation is the kind of coverage that does more damage than service to its subject. He is anointed as a generational talent. He is described as a master communicator. He is compared, in a profile that ran in a major Sunday magazine that month, to figures whose accomplishments dwarfed anything Jeffries had yet produced in his career. The profile noted, almost in passing, that he had never managed a serious legislative negotiation, never delivered a difficult caucus vote against the wishes of his members, never been tested in a moment of genuine national crisis. The profile did not dwell on those facts. The profile moved on to the alliteration, the rhyming peroration, the cadenced delivery that his admirers in the press had decided was the mark of a great orator rather than the tick of a man who had memorized a particular style of speaking in his 30s and never developed past it. That was the moment, if you were paying attention, when you could see exactly what the next 3 years were going to look like. A leader assembled by press release. A reputation built on the assumption that the cameras would never demand more than the cameras had been willing to accept. And a Democratic caucus that had decided, after the exhaustion of the Pelosi years, that what it needed was not a strategist, but a spokesman, not a tactician, but a face. Faces work until they are tested. They were about to be tested. They were going to fail the test. The press conference in question took place on a Thursday afternoon in the spring. The trigger was a series of remarks the president had made the previous evening at a rally in Pennsylvania. Remarks that the minority leader's office had spent the overnight hours preparing a response to, remarks that were, by any honest reading, the kind of provocation that a competent opposition would have been able to dismantle inside of 10 minutes with a calm and a clarity that left the provocateur looking small. The provocation was crude. It involved a series of nicknames, a series of mocking impressions, a series of dismissals of the minority leader's intelligence and competence that were, on their face, beneath the office of the presidency, and that a disciplined opposition would have used to its advantage. The opening was there. The opening was wide. The opening required only that the man stepping to the lectern understand what kind of moment he was in and meet it with something resembling the gravity the moment required. He did not meet it. He could not meet it. And the reason he could not meet it was that the moment required a kind of improvisation, a kind of from-the-gut response that the carefully constructed surface of Hakeem Jeffries had never been built to produce. He opened with the alliteration. He opened with the rhyming peroration. He opened with the cadenced delivery that his admirers had spent 3 years describing as the mark of greatness. The reporters in the room had heard it before. The reporters in the room had heard the same construction, the same cadence, the same rhyming pairs, in roughly 40 previous press conferences over the preceding 18 months. One of them, A correspondent for a wire service did something that has been done to American political figures for 2 centuries, and that I have not seen done to a Democratic leader in this particular way in a long time. The correspondent asked a follow-up. The follow-up was not hostile. The follow-up was not a trap. The follow-up was simply a request that the minority leader, having delivered the prepared remarks, explain in concrete terms what the House Democratic caucus was going to do about the substance of the matter at hand. What is the strategy? What is the timeline? What is the specific legislative or procedural response? The question was not difficult. The question was the question that any reporter would ask any leader of any caucus on any afternoon in any year. And Hakeem Jeffries, the master communicator, the generational talent, the leader assembled by press release, stood at the lectern and could not answer it. He attempted the alliteration again. The correspondent asked the question again. He attempted the rhyming peroration. The correspondent asked the question a third time, more pointed now, the room around him beginning to sense what was happening before he did. He looked down at his notes. The notes did not have the answer. He looked up. He said, and I am quoting from the transcript that was released within the hour and that has since been replayed on every cable network in the country, that the caucus would be developing its response in the days ahead and that he would have more to say on the matter at the appropriate time. The room understood what he had just said. The room had been told for 3 years that this man was a generational talent. The man had just confessed in front of the cameras that he did not have a strategy, did not have a timeline, and did not have a specific response on a matter that the leadership of his caucus had known was coming for at least the previous 14 hours. The cameras held on him. The cameras did not cut away. And then the cameras did something else. The cameras cut to the members of his own caucus standing behind him on the riser. The faces were the story. The faces had stopped pretending. The president responded within the hour. The response was posted to his preferred platform and amplified within minutes to a combined audience that the analytics firms later estimated at more than 90 million Americans across the various reposts and reactions. The response was not a rebuttal. The response was a montage. 40 seconds of clips of Jeffries delivering the same alliterative construction across the previous 18 months, set to a soundtrack that drew its humor from the repetition itself, ending on the moment from earlier that afternoon when the master communicator had stood at the lectern and confessed he had no answer. The video was vicious. The video was effective. The video did not contain a single false claim, did not require a single fabricated quotation, did not need a single piece of contextual distortion to make its point. The point made itself. The clips were the clips. The man had said what the man had said, and 90 million people watched it, and the clips trended for 72 hours, and the explanations from his office and from his allies in the press got smaller and more defensive and more visibly desperate as the 72 hours wore on. And by the time the news cycle had moved to whatever came next, the damage to Hakeem Jeffries as a public figure was the kind of damage that the apparatus around him is now going to spend the next year trying to undo, and that I do not believe the apparatus is going to succeed in undoing. Let me talk about why I think this matters, because the embarrassment of a single press conference is not, on its own, the story. The story is what the embarrassment revealed about a party that has been assembling its leadership by criteria that have very little to do with whether the leadership is capable of leading. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters. The Democratic Party in 2026 is a party that has spent the better part of a decade selecting its standard bearers on the basis of biography rather than achievement, demographics rather than demonstrated capacity, the comfort of donors and consultants rather than the requirements of the moment. It elevated a vice president to the presidential nomination in 2024 on the basis of a sequence that no internal party process would have ever produced if internal party processes were still functioning, and watched her lose a race that the analysts had been calling a coin flip, and that turned out, in the actual returns, to be a coin flip in only one direction. It elevated a minority leader in 2023 on the basis of a profile that had been written for him rather than earned by him. It has spent every quarter since attempting to convince the country that the leaders it has chosen are leaders. The country has reasons to trust, and the country, looking at the leaders, has been arriving at a different conclusion by margins that grow wider every time the question is put to a vote. The party is not losing because the country has moved to the right. The country has not moved that far to the right. The party is losing because the leaders the party keeps producing are leaders the country can see through within roughly the first 90 seconds of any unscripted exchange. Hakeem Jeffries is not the cause of that pattern. Hakeem Jeffries is the most recent and most visible example of it. The pattern was producing him long before the cameras arrived to record him failing. Let me talk about the substance of the failure, because the cadence was the surface, and the substance is what the cadence was concealing. In 3 years as minority leader, Jeffries has not produced a single legislative victory of significance against the Republican majority. He has not produced a single sustained communication strategy that has moved a single point on any major polling question. He has not produced a single moment of caucus discipline in a difficult vote that would have signaled to the country that the House Democratic Caucus operates as a coordinated political force rather than as a collection of individual members negotiating their own re-election strategies. The accomplishments his office cites, when asked, are accomplishments of process. The press releases on minor procedural victories. The committee assignments distributed in the manner of caucus housekeeping. The fundraising totals, which are real and substantial, and which I will concede in full, because the man can raise money. And raising money is the one thing the current Democratic apparatus is structurally well equipped to do. The fundraising is the floor of the operation. The fundraising is not the ceiling. And the country, watching the operation, has been waiting for the ceiling to appear, and the ceiling has not appeared. And the press conference last week was the moment when a significant portion of the country concluded that the ceiling was never going to appear, because the man at the top of the operation was not capable of building one. I want to take a moment here because I know how these conversations get framed, and I want to be careful about something that the cheaper voices in this debate are not going to be careful about. There are people who are going to use the failure of Hakeem Jeffries to advance arguments about black political leadership in general, and those people are wrong, and they have always been wrong. And the embarrassment of one particular leader on one particular afternoon gives them no license they did not already lack. The case against Hakeem Jeffries is not a case about black political leadership. The case against Hakeem Jeffries is a case about a specific man with a specific record and a specific demonstrated incapacity to do the specific job he was elevated to do. You can believe Hakeem Jeffries is a failed minority leader and still believe, as I do, that the project of black political leadership in this country is one of the most consequential and most necessary projects in the modern American experiment. Those two things are not in conflict. The case I am making is not the case the cheaper voices are going to try to make. The case I am making is about a man, a record, and a party that selected him for reasons that had more to do with the party's own internal anxieties than with the country's actual requirements. The party did this to itself. The man was the instrument. The instrument has now been broken in public, and the party is going to have to decide what comes next. And the decision the party makes is going to tell the country a great deal about whether the party has learned anything from the last 3 election cycles or is preparing to repeat them. Let me talk about the president, because the president is the other half of this story, and the story does not work without him. There are people who watch a moment like the one we watched last week and conclude that it tells us something about the brilliance of the man who orchestrated it. I think that conclusion gives him too much credit, and it is a kind of credit he does not need any more of. The president did not do anything in the response video that any communication shop with a video editor and a working knowledge of supercuts could not have done. The clips were sitting there. The cadence had been repeated so many times in so many settings that assembling the montage was not a matter of finding the material. The material was abundant. The material was lying on the surface, waiting for anyone to pick it up. What the president understood, and what the people around the minority leader did not understand, was that the surface was the entire surface. There was no second layer to defend. There was no deeper substance that the supercut would have failed to capture. The minority leader had constructed a public identity that consisted of one move performed at length, and the supercut revealed the one move, and the one move could not survive being seen all at once. That is not the president's brilliance. That is the minority leader's vulnerability. The president saw the vulnerability and exploited it. That is what political opponents do. The relevant question is not why the president did it. The relevant question is why the Democratic apparatus had spent 3 years building a leader whose public identity could be destroyed by a supercut. The answer to that question is the answer that the Democratic Party has been refusing to give itself for the better part of a decade. Let me talk about the caucus, because the caucus is the part of this that I think will matter most in the months ahead. The faces on the riser behind the minority leader that afternoon were faces that had stopped pretending. I want the listener to think about what that means. A caucus stands behind its leader at a press conference for one of two reasons. The first reason is solidarity, the public performance of loyalty, the message to the country that the team is the team and the leader speaks for the team. The second reason is theater, the performance of solidarity that is no longer believed in by the people performing it. And that is being performed only because the cost of not performing it is, in the short term, higher than the cost of performing it badly. The faces that afternoon were the second kind. The members behind him were not standing in solidarity. The members behind him were waiting. They were waiting for the press conference to end. They were waiting for the news cycle to move. They were waiting, in the way that political caucuses always begin to wait when the leadership has lost its capacity to deliver, for the inevitable conversation about whether the leadership should continue. That conversation has begun. The conversation is being conducted for the moment on background in private meetings, in the offices of senior members who came up under Pelosi and who remember what an actual leadership operation looks like. The conversation will move from background to on the record at some point in the next 3 to 6 months. The trigger will be a vote that the caucus loses by a wider margin than the leadership predicted, or a recruitment failure in a swing district that the leadership assured the party would be a recruitment success, or a fundraising quarter that comes in below the targets the leadership had set. The trigger will be something. The triggers are accumulating. And when the conversation moves on the record, the minority leader is not going to have the standing to defeat it, because the moment that defined his standing happened on a Thursday afternoon in the spring, in front of the cameras, in front of his own caucus, in front of the country, and the moment is on tape, and the tape is in the public domain, and the tape is not going to stop playing. I want to close on something I think the listener should sit with for a moment. The American political class has spent the last decade operating on the assumption that the public would continue to accept the leaders the political class selected, on the terms the political class offered, without asking the kinds of follow-up questions that a healthy democracy is supposed to ask. The arrangement worked for a while. The arrangement worked for as long as the cameras were willing to accept the surface, and the audience was willing to accept what the cameras showed. The arrangement is not working anymore. The cameras still show what the cameras show, but the audience has begun to look past the cameras to the unscripted exchange, the unrehearsed answer, the follow-up that the leader cannot answer. The press conference last week was a moment in which the audience and the cameras and the unscripted exchange all converged in real time on a single man at a single lectern. And the convergence revealed what the apparatus had spent 3 years concealing. The man could not answer the follow-up. The man had no strategy. The man had been elevated on the basis of a public identity that consisted of one move performed at length, and the move had been seen, and the move could not survive being seen again. That is what the country watched. That is what the country understood. And the Democratic Party is now going to have to reckon with the fact that the leader it selected to face this president in this political environment, at this particular moment in the country's history, was not capable of facing him, and that the failure was not a failure of one bad afternoon, but a failure of the criteria by which the party has been selecting its leaders for as long as it has been losing. January 2023 was the first warning sign, the leader assembled by press release, the profile that anointed him before he had earned the anointing, the cadence that his admirers described as mastery, and that turned out, on closer inspection, to be the only move the man knew how to perform. The country took its time arriving at the verdict. The country always takes its time. The cameras took longer than they should have to stop accepting the surface. But the verdict has arrived. The verdict was delivered on a Thursday afternoon in the spring in a room full of reporters who had finally decided to ask the follow-up question in front of a caucus that had finally stopped pretending, in front of 90 million Americans who watched the supercut and drew their conclusions. The president did not need to humiliate Hakeem Jeffries. The minority leader had been preparing the humiliation for 3 years. The president simply pressed the button on the editing software and let the clips do what the clips were always going to do. History will not remember this leadership the way its admirers hoped. It will remember the leadership the way the evidence demands. The receipts always come due. The cameras always catch up. The bill is now coming due, and the Democratic Party is the entity that is going to have to pay it.